The bright side of addiction is recovery, and recovery is an American way of life. Now, if you are in recovery or know or love someone who is, or maybe you just want to know a little bit more about the recovery process, maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who harmfully uses alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you as we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And remember, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured an historic interview that I uncovered in my archives with Betty Ford, actor John Larroquette, astronaut Buzz Aldrin, musician Bonnie Raitt, authors Brene Brown, Anne Lamott, J.A. Jance, former NFL player Ryan Leaf, and former NFL superstar Thomas Hollywood Henderson. Plus, everyday people in long-term recovery with at least 1 year of continuous recovery, sharing their story, their insight, and their path. Welcome to Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. In this edition, we're going to go back into the radio archives of Recovery Coast to Coast. I'll share an interview that I did a number of years ago with the amazing Chris O'Dell. Now, she had an amazing life in the middle of rock and roll history. She drugged and drank with the best of them, including George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Mick Jagger, Eric Clapton, Leon Russell, and others. She did find recovery, and she has maintained long-term recovery. She wrote one of the absolute best books on living a life with the Beatles from the inside out. In fact, George Harrison even wrote and recorded a song for Chris, which was on the flip side of George's 1973 hit, Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth. It's called Miss O'Dell. Her book, also called Miss O'Dell, Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, and Eric Clapton. Here is a quick clip from today's interview.
I had three bottoms. I tell people that, and when I tell my story, I had an idea of what I thought a mother was supposed to be, and I wasn't it. And my husband, Anthony, was using, and, we just weren't, we had an au pair girl, and she was basically taking care of our son. So I just woke up one morning, and Astrid Wyman had gotten into recovery before anyone I knew, after she and Bill broke up. So I called her up and said, would you go to a meeting with me? So we went to a 12-step meeting, and that was really it. That did it. I got completely sober.
In the rooms.
In the rooms.
My conversation with Chris O'Dell is coming right up. I'm Neil Scott, host of Recovery Coast to Coast, and I want to begin this podcast with a huge thank you. A thank you to you from me. Now, I realize you've got a lot of podcasts that you could be listening to. There's a lot of podcasts out there on recovery. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Our website, by the way, recoverycoasttocoast, one word, .org. Following 17 years of nightly broadcasting on iHeartRadio in Seattle, our podcast features interviews with everyday people in recovery, as well as clinicians, authors, and recovering celebrities who offer the promise of hope and the reality of recovery, plus well-vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends. We invite you to enjoy the podcast and to share it with your friends as well. As I said before, recovery is an American way of life, and recovery is as recovery does. A reminder, our email address, in case you would like to get in touch with us, we'd love to hear from you, recoverycoasttocoast, one word, @comcast.net. Recovery Coast to Coast is supported by Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs. When it comes to deciding on a treatment center, one thing is important: trust. Check out each program that you're considering. Keep in mind, there are a lot of bad actors out there, and what you see is not always what you get. And don't make the decision solely on price, but on experience and quality of the staff. That's what makes a treatment center successful. It certainly makes Sundown a success. Their staff is well respected, well paid, and they have a long history of working together with Sundown M Ranch. Many of the people actually went through Sundown. Sundown checks all the boxes. They've been successfully treating individuals and families for 55 years. It's nationally recognized for quality programming and professional caregivers. They are abstinence-based, 12-step centered. The cost of treatment is all-inclusive and based on each patient's needs. This is not a cookie-cutter program. And they are a not-for-profit treatment center located on 30 acres at the mouth of the beautiful Yakima River Canyon in central Washington, not too far from Seattle. Don't get bamboozled by high-priced, slick advertising that makes treatment sound like a vacation. It is not a vacation. What it is a wonderfully successful program dealing with addiction and mental health disorders as well. Oh, yeah, they also have a state-of-the-art adolescent program as well. They've been successfully treating patients and families for 55 years. Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins, sundown.org. All right, it's that time. It is, you guessed it, coffee time and conversation time. As I pour myself a cup of coffee, we're going to dip into the audio archives of Recovery Coast to Coast and present an interview I did with an amazing woman in long-term recovery who's had a life like no other, right in the middle of sex, love, and rock and roll. Her name's Chris O'Dell, and over 10 years ago, she wrote a book about life with the likes of the Beatles, the Stones, Leon Russell, Bob Dylan, and more, and the ultimate journey that led her into long-term recovery. Miss O'Dell, My Hard Day and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the women they loved. Chris is now working on a new book of her memorabilia, and she's the subject of a new documentary that is scheduled for release in early 2024. She's a former addiction counselor who now lives in Tucson and is filled with gratitude as a woman in long-term recovery. Now, in the interview that you're about to hear, we'll talk about 3 songs that are significant to the story. However, due to copyright law, podcasts are not allowed to use recorded songs. So I will put a link to those songs, and there are 3 of them. Miss O'Dell by George Harrison, and 2 songs written for Chris by Leon Russell, Pisces Apple Lady and Hummingbird. They will be in the show notes. Be sure and give those a listen after you finish the podcast. But right now, let's turn back the clock and hear an archived interview with the amazing Chris O'Dell, who sang on the Beatles' hit Hey Jude and was one of the very few who was on the roof for the famous rooftop concert by the Beatles, which was to be their last live concert. Here now is that conversation. Welcome back once again to Recovery Coast to Coast, talking about addiction with a focus on recovery. And a reminder, if you missed any of the programs, you can go to our website. You can find the last 5 programs available to listen to in real time, or you can download them or podcast them as well. www.recoverycoasttocoast.org. Chris O'Dell joining us. The book is called Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the women that they loved. I had the opportunity to read an advance copy of this book, gave it to a lot of my friends. It's an outstanding book. In fact, it is my favorite book for the entire year. And Chris joining us from Tucson. Chris, how you doing?
I'm great, thank you. I like that, Neil. Thank you.
It is an absolute wonderful book, and it's told in a matter-of-fact style. There's nothing really sensationalistic about it. You were in the right place at the right time for a whole lot of things to happen.
Exactly.
The book starts off back in the spring of 1968. An old boyfriend of yours introduces you to a guy by the name of Derek Taylor. And the rest, I guess, as they say, is history because there was magic in the air. Talk about that night, Chris.
Well, I'm so glad you're saying it like that, though, because it's true. You know, people think that I had to manipulate my way into this, and truthfully, I wasn't that smart then. But it was this friend of mine he was a record producer, and we were going out, and he was late picking me up, and I was angry. And he called me up and said, I want you to come to the La Brea Inn because I want you to meet Derek Taylor. And Derek at that time, he had been press agent for the Beatles during the time they were doing all of their touring still in the early 60s. He was from Liverpool. And he had left them for a while and come to L.A. and was doing public relations for some different bands like the Band and the Mamas and Papas, or not the Band, the Byrds, Mamas and Papas, some other bands. And he, at this point, was working at A&M Records. And he was just kind of the toast of the town, you might say, because he was such an amazing man, very charming, very Errol Flynn-ish. So I said, no, I'm not coming. And he said, and my friend said, but you've got to meet him. You know, he's friends with the Beatles. He did their press. And I thought, sure, nobody knows the Beatles. The Beatles are this, you know, they're out there in netherworld. We don't know them. And anyway, he convinced me that I should come down. So I thought, okay. So I went down, and sure enough, there was Derek. And it didn't take but a second to recognize that he was everything that people said he was. You know, that he knew a lot of people, and he knew a lot, and he was just the most dynamically engaging man.
Very quickly, you find yourself over in England.
Very quickly, probably 2 or 3 months later, if I think about it, yeah.
Tell me the story about the young singer-songwriter who Derek Taylor set you up with for dinner.
Oh, yes. He told me this new artist they had just signed to Apple, this good, nice American boy, was someone I should spend the evening with because he didn't want me to be alone. And so I go back to the hotel, and there's a knock at the door, and I open the door, and there's this long string beanie fellow standing there with a guitar in a case in his hand. And I kind of said, hi, I'm Chris. And he said, hi, I'm James Taylor.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay, come on in. And he did. He came in, and we had something to eat, and then he started playing his guitar, and the song that he played me was Caroline on My Mind. He was working on it at that time.
Wrote that in your room.
Certainly worked on it in there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, the book goes from 1968 to 1986, nearly 30 years. Why write the book now, Chris?
For several reasons, Neil. Number one is that there was a kind of unspoken rule when you worked with the Beatles and you were friends, especially being friends with the Beatles, that you just didn't talk about it. It was more done out of loyalty to the band. Today you sign contracts. Back then it was just a loyalty issue. And so part of it was that because I'd maintained friendships with George and Patty and Ringo, and so that was part of it. And I think when George died, there was a little bit of a feeling of a little bit more room to be able to talk about what I knew. And then it just, there was just so much time had passed. I mean, it's kind of like history.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What has the reaction been from Beatles fans? They must have certainly emailed you.
Beatles fans are loving it. They don't love books where you put them down. They want you to write wonderful things about these people that they adore, and there are some serious Beatle fans out there, and they're just wonderful. I mean, they're supportive. They write me these wonderful emails and are just really thrilled to feel, because what they're feeling is what the intention of the book was, which was to make them feel as though they were there.
And the book certainly does that. The book is called Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the Women They Loved, co-written by Kathy Ketchum, who I believe is, bar none, the best writer in the field of addiction. She has written an incredible amount of work, probably sold over 1 million copies, and you were so very fortunate to link up with Kathy on this book.
No kidding.
She is something else. One particular poignant moment in the book, Chris, took place in Ringo's kitchen when George Harrison told Ringo that he was actually in love with Ringo's wife. Talk about that.
Well, it was an unexpected thing. I had begun to pick up. I was spending Christmas and New Year's in London, or in England, and I had decided I would spend Christmas with Patty and George and New Year's with Ringo and Maureen. And we just went over one evening when I first got there, and I kind of knew something was going on. It felt a little weird. There were some weird, undertones. Maureen was around a lot. And when George made this pronouncement, I think there were probably 5 of us at the table, and there was dead the air was silent. Their silence was silent. It was just this kind of, oh my God, I mean, you just can't, what do you do? And I think everyone, except maybe for George, was sitting there in shock. And there was this silence, and then Ringo kind of said, well, better you than someone we don't know.
Well, reading that, I felt I was at the table.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was very, very, very powerful.
Yeah, the heart stops, huh?
Yeah. And the entire book is some real good backstory stuff on the Beatles, including the drug usage. And certainly there was a lot of drugs that were used back then, a lot of alcohol. But talk about the drug use. It was certainly a different time then and a different culture.
Yeah. You know, actually, since this book has been out, I've thought more about this than I did prior. But in reflection, I realized that, you know, sometimes people ask me, well, what was the difference between working for the Beatles and the Stones? And there were definite differences. But one of the things that the Beatles I worked for in the 60s, and at that time, it was love and peace and LSD and pot and alcohol. But it was all in a spirit of goodwill, it seemed, at that time, you know. And we were experimenting, and we were in our early 20s. By the 70s, suddenly cocaine and heroin and much harder drugs had crept into at least my scene. And it seemed to have changed a lot of us in many different ways, you know. So it was harder going in the 70s, I think.
It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and of course,
Definitely.
with the Stones, they had you run a little mission for Keith.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, you know, when we wrote this, I really didn't think it would create this much attention. But it's referred to as my drug run for Keith, that I was the drug runner, which I have a hard time kind of seeing. But one time, Keith, we were on tour, and, you know, Mick said, we were in Kansas City, and Mick said, would you fly to New York and get my camera lens fixed? And I did. We were in Dallas, and Keith said, would you fly to New York and pick up some stuff for me? So I did. It just seemed like part of the routine then, you know, to do things that they needed done, and that was part of what Keith's needs were. It didn't seem like a big deal because we had no security back then at airports. You know, the chances of, you know, someone took me to the airport, someone picked me up. To me, the scariest part was driving to an area of Los Angeles I wasn't familiar with.
And this was a pretty seedy area.
It was an area, yeah, it was. It was an area that, where, I mean, we were talking about, you know, I knew drug dealers that were around, but they were kind of Hollywood drug dealers. They were, you know, associated with the music business or something. But this was not what this was. This was serious stuff. And so that was frightening to me. But the fear of being caught carrying it back to Texas wasn't a fear. I didn't even consider that at that time.
Chris O'Dell joining us tonight. She's the author of Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the Women They Loved. And Chris, by the way, was probably the first female tour manager in the music business. I'm not sure there's many of them out there today. What was that whole experience like for you?
Well, it was really, you know, it goes back to, I just kind of slid into things without realizing.
You were at the right place at the right time so many times.
Totally.
It's been amazing.
My higher power has been on my side many times, I'll tell you. But, yeah, I had been on the Stones tour. I had worked for two of the biggest, in fact, the two biggest bands in the world. You know, I learned how to do the travel part of it, and before I know it, you know, Bill Graham's company in San Francisco said, well, come on, let's use you on a tour. So I then went out on some of the biggest tours of the time, starting with Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. It never occurred to me I was the first female. It never did, because I seemed to always be around men. I mean, the musicians were mostly men. You know, it was just kind of part of the environment that I went in, and it never occurred to me that everyone I worked with were men. And, you know, there were a few exceptions, but mostly it was all a male world. It just didn't occur to me. What I knew is I had to get up and do the best job I could. You know, and that's what I did.
You delivered drugs for Keith, and you delivered harmonicas for Bob Dylan.
Yeah. Contrast. Quite a contrast.
Talk about that trip.
Well, I was still working for the Beatles then, and it was 1969, and Bob Dylan had been recovering from this motorcycle accident, apparently, and so he'd flown down to the Isle of Wight. George and Patty Harrison flew down to meet and stay with him and his wife Sarah, and they realized he'd forgotten his harmonicas. So George called Apple and said, Can you go and get harmonicas and bring them down to the Isle of Wight? And at the time, I was going to go down there, but I was going to go on a train, like everybody else. And so this friend that I worked with at Apple, we picked up the harmonicas at a store. We got on a helicopter, and we flew to the Isle of Wight and landed in the backyard of the farmhouse Bob was staying with. And, that was the most interesting thing, to sort of be landing this helicopter, and you see people kind of peeking out of bushes and everything. And then you look in there, out of the one window is Bob Dylan staring, watching us come down. It was worth it. Let me put it that way.
Chris O'Dell, the author of Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the Women They Loved. You can find it at Amazon.com. It's published by Touchstone, and of course it's also co-authored by my very dear friend Kathy Ketchum. I certainly encourage people to pick up a copy of this book, because it really is a chronology of the music business for some 20, 30 years, told in a very, very interesting, matter-of-fact style. What is your fondest memory from that time, Chris?
Oh, my gosh, there's so many. It was, I had snapshots of moments that were just amazing. I think being on the roof during the recording of the Beatles' apparently last concert together, and being in the studio with the Beatles, being on tour with the Stones,
singing with the Beatles, Chris.
Singing with the Beatles.
Tell that story.
What a resume, huh? Well, I was at Trident Studios, and it was I booked the sessions, most of the sessions for Apple. So it was natural to just go over there and make sure everything was cool. And the Beatles were recording, putting some final touches on Hey Jude. And Paul came bouncing up the stairs into the control room and talked to George Martin, the producer, and then turned and said, "Come on, Chris, we need you downstairs." And really? For what? And he said, "Well, we're going to put vocals on." Well, I'm not a singer. I never pretended to be. But I thought, okay. So I went down the stairs into the studio, and fortunately there were the orchestra members, and there were the Beatles, and there was me, and Yoko. And we just sang on the chorus. And, at first I mouthed the words because I was afraid I'd sing off key. But then I realized, no, come on, don't pass this one up.
After I read that in the book, I went out and listened to the song again, and I heard your voice.
I bet you did. Off tune.
I want to ask you about another person in the book who most people probably would kind of gloss over, but since he's been on the radio show a number of times, I need to ask you about Gary Stromberg.
My pal Gary.
And about that infamous plane ride.
Well, I have to tell you about Gary. I met Gary when he had a PR company, and I was working for the Stones, and he was just the craziest guy. And when we were on tour, he was one of those people that, he and my friend Astrid, who was with Bill Wyman at the time, the three of us were like the Three Musketeers. But the nice thing about Gary is he carried a prophylactic. I always thought that was so weird. A prophylactic full of cocaine. And I thought, how can you tell how much you've got? Because it expanded. On the trip that we came, I think the one you're referring to is the one that was in the film that the Stones did.
Yes.
When they brought a couple girls, not they being the Stones, but people on the tour who were hired, brought a couple girls on the plane and decided to have an orgy on the plane during the flight between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. I sat in front with Gary and Astrid and Bill's son Stephen, and we just kind of didn't look back that way. I actually, if you want to know the truth, that was one of the dark moments for me in working for them. I really didn't see any point. I didn't like the way the girls were being used, and it was a dark moment.
Biggest regret on the Magical Mystery Tour?
That's a tough one. I don't know if I have any regrets. I'm sure if I really think very, very clearly, but nothing that pops up. It was, I could and probably would have at one time saying that, using drugs, or that if I didn't drink so much, maybe I would have had a better job, But it's hard to look back. Everything that I did took me to where I am today.
It's been an amazing journey, obviously. The book is called Miss Odell, which also has a connection to a song that was written for you, one of 3 songs actually written for you, this one written by George. Talk about that.
Well, George and Patty became extremely good friends of mine. Patty, to this day, is basically my best friend, and we keep in touch a lot. But I got very, very close to George, even before I knew her, and he came to L.A. on a business trip one summer in the early 70s and called me up when he got in and asked me to come out to the beach house he was staying at in Malibu. And I procrastinated. I didn't want to make the drive, or I didn't feel, I remember thinking I was afraid there'd be a bunch of hangers-on out there and that it wouldn't be fun and I wouldn't like it. And I kind of knew the people that usually flocked around him in L.A. So I didn't go for a couple days, and he would call and leave a message, and I'd just say, well, okay, maybe today, and I just kept putting it off. It's hard to look back and think, why, But when I finally made it out there, probably within 3 or 4 days, and I finally got there, there was no one out there. In fact, as I found out, he had been out there mostly on his own for all those days. And we had a little dinner, and we were sitting there in the living room, and he said, oh my gosh, I almost forgot, I've got something for you. I'm going to make you famous. And I thought, oh God, what could this be? Because, he could come up, he, like some of these people, could come up with some things that you would prefer they hadn't come up with. And so I was a little nervous, and he came out with his acoustic guitar, and he sat down and he played the song Miss Odell. And most of it's about other things. The chorus is, why don't you call me Miss Odell? And I was just blown away. I totally could not believe that George had written the song with my name in the title.
During your time in those 20, 30 years, you had a long-term relationship with Leon Russell.
Yeah.
And Leon also wrote a couple of songs for you.
He did. He wrote Pisces Apple Lady for me when he had already had Delta Lady, which in fact Joe Cocker already was coming out with. I think Joe had already had a song out. I can't remember, but he came over, and I guess he was into writing about ladies back at that time. So he came to Apple. He met me. He found out I was a Pisces, and he wrote the song for me. And in fact, I kind of didn't, brushed him off. I don't know how else to put it. And then he was about to leave town, and I said, well, I'd like to see you before you go. So I went to the studio that night, and that's what they were recording. And I was like sitting there going, Pisces, Apple, Lady. Now, wait a minute. That's kind of weird. And
connect the dots, Chris.
Connect the dots. Took me a little while. And then, after that, of course, he had my full attention.
Leon Russell also wrote another song for you called Hummingbird. Tell me about that.
Hummingbird he wrote one night when I had, I guess I had gotten really drunk. Let's say it like it is. I had gotten really drunk. He had a studio in his house and a couple of musicians, and I sat around drinking, and I guess I had gotten so drunk that apparently during the night I kept going into him and saying, I have to go back to London now.
Oh,
so I went upstairs, passed out. And the next morning, when I woke up, he said, well, I wrote the song for you. I want to play it for you. And he had just put it down on a cassette. And he played it. And, first of all, I was extremely humiliated. But also, it was a beautiful song.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was very beautiful.
You were involved with Bob Dylan's Rolling Thunder tour, and which was spectacular. And there was a song that Joni Mitchell did called Coyote. Talk about that.
Right. Well, Joni came out on the tour about halfway through. It was quite an amazing tour. It was crazy. And also there was a playwright named Sam Shepard.
Sure.
Who came out. And, of course, no one who didn't know the theater really knew him or knew Paul, any of that, but apparently he was very good. And he was there, and he had come to write the script for what was going to be the film called Ronaldo and Clara, which was they were going to record or film throughout the whole tour. But, I think Sam was a little kind of taken back by the craziness of a rock and roll tour. Anyway, he and I had a relationship, and in the middle of it appears Joni, and then I find out kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I didn't know that he was also starting to have one with her. Let's put it that way. And then so somewhere in there, Joni and I can't come face to face on this one, and her way of writing it, we did actually, and ended up being very good friends and talked about it later. But she wrote a song about Coyote, which would have been Sam, and a woman down the hall, and that would have been me.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness.
And if I had been the songwriter, she would have been the woman down the hall.
And you were also a mystery woman on a Stones album, as I recall.
Well, my picture is on the back cover of Exile on Main Street, and I guess, people have told me since the book came out, people said, I listened to this song, Miss Odell, and I didn't know who the heck she was. And then other people have said, I saw that picture on Exile on Main Street, and I didn't have any idea who that was.
The song Miss Odell was a B-side of a George Harrison hit.
Right, Give Me Love,
Give Me Love,
Peace.
absolutely.
Right.
In the back of the book, kind of a where are they now? And you list the deaths of 15 people who have died, who you were pretty close to during that time. And then the people who are still alive, and it was kind of like, it reminded me of what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now.
Yes, that's very interesting.
And where they are now. And,
right.
And we go beyond the book, and if you're just joining us, Chris Odell, the author of Miss Odell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the Women They Loved. Find it at Amazon.com. To me, it is absolutely, without question, my favorite book of the year, and I think when you read it, it will be yours as well. It is told in such a wonderful, matter-of-fact style. And if you look at it and you think, well, the women they loved and all these names, and it's a sensational book, it's not a sensational book. It's a sensational story, and she was at the right place at the right time. Miss Odell, by the way, is in recovery, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But at the back of the book, it kind of brings everybody up to date on where they are today. And, of course, in 1985, you married Anthony Russell, and a year later, of course, blessed by the birth of your son, William, who is now, 23?
23.
My math is right, 23.
He is very good. He is 23.
Yeah, and living down in Tucson. As you got off that period of time, that nearly 30 years of a Magical Mystery Tour, you were using quite a bit.
I went through different periods. I had 3 bottoms.
3 bottoms.
I had 3 bottoms. I tell people that, and when I tell my story, I share that. I say, I didn't just have one. One wasn't enough.
Well,
I had to have 3 of them. And so that by the time I got to my 3rd one, it was 1980. 88.
What happened with that in terms of the last of the drinking, using, and the beginning of a program of recovery?
Well, I had tried several times, more than several times, but I had actually, I think the first time I ever realized I had a problem, truthfully, was after the Stones tour. And so I quit for a while, but I didn't know about AA. What I knew about AA was Days of Wine and Roses. It's like you had to be really in the gutter. I was not in the gutter. I had famous friends and, traveled in high circles, but so I didn't think I'd fit there. So then I started using again. The second time I lived in Germany, and I went to a Frank Zappa concert. Well, I was working on a Frank Zappa concert there and made a complete fool of myself, and I went, okay, this is a problem. So I went to AA in Germany and in Frankfurt, and I attended AA German meetings. Well, I spoke German, but not that well, so it was really kind of difficult to get all what I needed to get out. But I could admit I was an alcoholic at that point. When William was about a year and a half, I had him late in life. I was 39 when he was born, and I had an idea of what I thought a mother was supposed to be, and I wasn't it. and my husband Anthony was using, and we just weren't, we had no pair girl, and she was basically taking care of our son. So I just woke up one morning, and Astrid Wyman had gotten into recovery before anyone I knew, after she and Bill broke up. So I called her up and said, "Would you go to a meeting with me?" And so we went to a 12-step meeting, and that was really it. That did it.
So you did not go through treatment per se?
No, I got completely sober.
In the rooms?
In the rooms, right.
In the rooms. And then as you found long-term recovery, you gravitated into helping other people, and you went to school, and you became a licensed therapist. Talk about what life is like today and that whole process, Chris.
Well, it was really interesting because when I look back, I realized I was always listening to people and trying to help them figure out how to deal with their lives, just through rock and roll and everything. So I had been very interested in hypnotherapy. I became certified as a hypnotherapist in Los Angeles, and when I moved to Tucson, Tucson is the land of recovery. We have 2 ginormous treatment centers here that are, by that I mean nationally recognized. And I think just being around that, it made me realize that I loved doing the hypnotherapy. I loved the therapeutic part of it. So I realized that I had to do something. I was a single mom by this time, and I needed to earn a living, and the therapy just seemed like such a great thing. And then helping other people who were suffering from the diseases that I was going through, just, it all made sense. It really made sense. So I decided, I didn't go to college before that, and it wasn't even on my radar screen, really. And so I had to start right from the beginning, first semester in college, and it took me a long time, but I made it through my bachelor's degree, and then I made it through my master's degree, and decided I didn't need to get my PhD, and started working as a counselor. It's such a difficult disease, and it doesn't make sense to people a lot of the time. So, I really think it helps to have the experience behind you. But I worked as an addiction counselor for quite a long time.
Of course, your son William is 23. What has his reaction been to all of this?
Well, he kind of had a taste of it. He knew that this person. Do you remember Shining Time Station? That Ringo used to be the station master. If you had children, then you know it, right? Yes. And he was this little tiny station manager. Well, we used to watch that. We were living in Tucson, and I'd say, "William, that's your godfather. That's Ringo, your godfather." And he knew he had run into Ringo, or later he did, but at that time he hadn't met him. He just thought he was this little tiny guy. And when Ringo and Barbara came to our house the first time in Tucson, and Ringo got out of a car, and he was actually a regular-sized human being, my son ran for cover. I was like, no.
That's a funny story.
So, he's kind of he hasn't been around it a lot, but Ringo's given him his drumsticks and said, "Go play the drums in the other room." So he knew that much of it, and it slowly began to make sense. But when the book came out, I said to him, "Look, you need to read this before the book comes out.
Good for you.
I want you to know what's there. I don't want you to be blindsided by it." And his reaction was, "Mom, come on, you were a young kid then." And I said, "Well, that's good, but you still need to read this." So he did, and I don't know how in depth he read it, but enough so he didn't get surprised by it. But he seems to just accept that was my past, and he's been very aware of my recovery. He would go, sometimes he would go into the rooms with me, when he was little and everything. So he's seen both sides of it.
You want to find out more about Chris and more about the book. The book is profiled at www.missodell.com, and I commend you for really telling the story in such a simple, understandable, not sensationalistic style. What has the reaction been from some of the people that you talk about in the book, including the Stones and Bob Dylan and of course Ringo and Paul?
Well, I haven't really heard too much back. I sent Ringo and Barbara a copy. They asked if I would send them a copy a couple weeks ago, and I haven't really heard back from them. But from the looks of things, they've been pretty busy. So, it takes a while for them to read it. I think it's hard for them to read stuff from that period of time. Linda Ronstadt called me up about a month ago, and she was halfway through it and just loved it. She said, "Oh, it's so interesting to see what you were doing while I was back in L.A. struggling." I had a wonderful email from Cameron Crowe who read it and just loved it. It's been good. I haven't heard from, a lot of those people because I don't generally have contact with them. But, it was done with love. And if it's read with love, great. If it's not, well, I can't do much about that.
What about Leon?
Leon was great. I sent him a copy early on and asked him for an endorsement, and he read it, and he wrote a beautiful endorsement, and I really appreciated that.
Do you still have a love for music?
I do. I went out with Linda Ronstadt in '04. She asked me if I would go out again on tour with her, and I'm like, well, okay. Here I'm getting my master's degree, but sure, I'll go be a tour manager again. I didn't like the road too much anymore, but I loved being in the room and on the side of the stage with the music, and I loved the environment. I just loved listening to the music. That was the whole reason for being there.
And here you are some 20 years after all of this happened, and you write the book, and it generates all of these feelings, all of these memories. Any inclination to go back and do it again?
To go back?
You have to go back and do some tours.
Oh, no.
No, that's...
Definitely not.
That's definitely in the past.
Airports are too much trouble today.
Boy, are they ever.
I don't even want to drive across, fly to Phoenix.
Yeah. Well, it's a remarkable book, and I congratulate you, and I congratulate Kathy Ketchum, who wrote the book with you. And again, Kathy is by far the best writer in the field of addictions. Under the Influence was the first giant book where she translated Dr. Jim Milam into everyday English, and of course, The Imperfection of Spirituality, a dynamite book.
Right, and she was so helpful in making this what it is. Yeah.
It's a great book, and again, I want to give out the websites, www.missodell.com, to find out more about Chris, and I wish you continued success, Chris, one day at a time.
Thank you so much, Neil. I so liked being here.
Chris O'Dell, the author of Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the women they loved. And if you're looking for a great book to give as a gift, and if maybe you grew up during the time of the Beatles, Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, this is an incredible read. I promise you, you will absolutely love it.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with a woman who became familiar with rock, roll, and recovery. And again, I want to remind you that there are links to the 3 songs that Chris mentions in the interview. Miss O'Dell, written and recorded by George Harrison, and 2 songs written and recorded by Leon Russell for Chris, Pisces, Apple Lady, and Hummingbird. They are in the show notes. I invite you to check them out. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast that if you would like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path that you've chosen, as long as you have been in continuous recovery for a year or more, do drop us a note, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Coming up next, an actress and a woman in long-term recovery, Ali McGraw. She will share some reflections on recovery in just 30 seconds.
Are you afraid? Afraid of life without drugs and alcohol? There is help and hope at Sundown M Ranch. At Sundown, the focus is on you and your disease. You will learn how to live without depending on drugs and alcohol. Sundown M Ranch is nationally recognized for effective and affordable alcohol and drug treatment programs. Reclaim your life. Replace your fears with hope. Go to www.sundown.org right now to learn more.
And now, as promised, here is the iconic actress, Ali McGraw.
I affirm the inestimable value of honesty in my life today. When I am temporarily blown off course by unexpected events or seeming adversity, an honest appraisal of the situation can keep me anchored in reality. So long as I am honest with myself, with others, and with God, I can weather any storm. Through honest self-evaluation, I am learning a great deal about myself. The deeper I dig and the more truths I unearth, the better equipped I am to accept and initiate change. My dedication to truth enhances my self-esteem. What a relief it is to put aside the masks and camouflage of yesterday and be the real me. How good it makes me feel when I am able to talk openly and honestly about my fears and foibles, when I can share a secret or admit a mistake. Honesty in its various dimensions has done much to improve my relationships with family, friends, and co-workers. I once felt it was too complicated to tell the truth, and of course the exact opposite is the case. Life is so much simpler now that everyone knows where I stand and what I'm about. Thought for today. If at times it seems difficult to know God's will, I can be certain that complete honesty is a step in the right direction.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please share it with others via social media or simply by telling someone about it. You can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. If you'd like to get in touch, our email, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Also, please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. And remember, if you know someone who is experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here's a 24-hour national helpline that offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals available as well. Number's pretty easy to remember, 1-800-622-HELP. And we encourage you to check out Find Support, that's one word, findsupport.gov. It's a brand new website designed for individuals, families, and friends, including how to pay for treatment, including low-cost treatment, and even some free treatment options as well. Findsupport.gov. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. Another shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins, sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.